Thank you for the invitation and the introduction. So I'm indeed going to speak about electronic voting and how we can help in this area. So why so many people are moving to e-voting? So there are several reasons or motivations. One often mentioned reason is that it's convenient, because then people may vote from everywhere, from their home or abroad when they are traveling. Also for authorities, they don't need to watch the ballot box the whole day, and then sometimes have to make the ballot box travel. They can just, they have less work typically. There are also motivation in the fact that when you have complex tally system where you have a ranking, for example, you rank the candidates and then you do the tally using STV, Condorcet, IRV, or any of your favorite tally methods, then it's almost impossible to do it by hand. I mean, it's really too tedious. So you need some automation just to count just to decide the winners. Another argument, for example, used in Switzerland is that when you have electronic voting, then you may use it more frequently to consult your population on several questions. And also in some cases, it might be easier to comply with some legal rules. So for example, in Australia, people may vote on the whole, not on the whole country, but on the whole region. So that's very broad. And so they need to make the ballots travel, which is both complex and not necessarily very safe. And so many protocols have been proposed in companies, but also in the academic side. So I'm mentioning some of them, like Helios, Benios, Civitas, Pret-a-Voter, Selen, but I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of them, so there are really many. And one distinction I'd like to make in this talk is that with electronic voting, there is typically two main systems that are covered. One is with voting machine, where people still attend polling stations, so they have to go to a special place, and there they are using a computer that is dedicated to this. And the good thing is that they can use standard authentication means, like ID card and so on, but they have to use the machines they are given, and they don't necessarily know a lot what is used here. And then there are internet voting, where people may vote from home, then they are using their own machines, and then you have other issues like how to authenticate people and also how to make sure the computer is not compromised. So these two systems have the same kind of issues and goals, but still on these talks I'll mostly focus on internet voting, so voting from remotely. So internet voting is actually used in many countries, like in France, to elect some of the representatives at the national parliament. In Australia, as I just mentioned, with about 300,000 votes cast by internet. In Estonia, for a long time, this is probably the country that started in the most early to use electronic voting. In Switzerland, they are in a long process to use more and more electronic voting, but so they are increasingly expanding both their requirements and how they use electronic voting. And on the other hand, it has been banned in some countries. So for example, in Netherlands, they were using voting machine and internet in the early years, and now it's completely forbidden. In Germany, they have even a law saying that one special case of voting machines, the NEDAP machine, are judged to be not to comply with the constitution, so they are completely forbidden. And in general, they say it must be possible for a citizen to check that the main steps of a voting system, it should be possible for a citizen to check the main steps of a voting machine without any special expertise, which in practice means no electronic voting. And in Norway, there are trials, and it was quite successful, but then the public becomes to be aware that they had no real means to make sure that their vote would be really counted. So the population started to fear the whole process. So they stopped just because if people don't trust the process, then you undermine the democratic process. And it's also used a lot in non-political elections. So people are usually only thinking about political elections. So here, just in France, for example, it's used a lot in professional election with millions of voters. And you're probably surprised in your own country how often it can be used for various elections, so professional election, but also in healthcare, in administration councils, in scientific councils. So it's used a lot in medium-scale election or low-scale election. And of course, there are good reasons to fear electronic voting because there have been numerous attacks. So just to give you, there are a long list, so I selected two. Like in Switzerland, they were about to use a new system, and due to the law, they had to make a public pen test. And flaws were found, showing that the authorities had the ability to change the result without being caught. And 2 months ago, a colleague of mine showed that for the elections that were held in Moscow in September, they were actually using so weak keys that it was possible to break them in 20 minutes. And there is still a long list of attacks, so there are good reasons not to believe in the security of e-voting. So let's take it in the other way. What would be a good voting system? What do we want about this kind of system? So the first property that typically come to our mind is privacy. No one should know how I voted, so that I can vote how I want to vote. And actually, as soon as you are in electronic voting, it's even better if you have receipt-freeness or coercion resistance. And no one should know how I voted, even if I'm willing to tell my vote. So you could say, okay, in a paper ballot election, I can tell for who I voted. Yes, I can tell, but I can lie. So I can tell I can openly tell I voted for A, but maybe I still voted for B. You cannot know. So we need the same thing with electronic voting, because otherwise it will be possible to buy my vote or to coerce me to vote in a certain way. If I can prove to you that I have voted A, then you can buy my vote or force me to vote for A. And another property that we have due to the fact that it's now with keys and encryption and so on is we have also to think about everlasting privacy, which means will your vote still be secret in 20 years? Because for the cryptography we are using now, we are quite confident it's secure, but maybe the keys will be broken in 20 years. So is it possible to know how you voted for in 20 years when the cryptography will be broken, or new attacks will be found, whatever? In some context, it's important that your privacy is not broken even in 20 years later. And so this is about confidentiality, privacy, no one should know how I voted. And on the other hand, like for paper ballot, we'd like to have verifiability. So it should be possible for every voter to check that her ballot is in the ballot box. So this is what we call individual verifiability. It should be possible to check that the result corresponds to the ballot box. This is what we call universal verifiability. And also, it should be possible to check that the ballot box the ballots that are in the ballot box are only legitimate ballots. They come from people that have the right to vote. This is what we call eligibility verifiability. Otherwise, there might be some ballot stuffing, for example. And when you have verifiability, then you don't need to verify the whole system, like the whole code that is running on the voting server, because it is huge. You not need to verify the system, just the election, so just the data. So it's typically smaller. And there are other properties, for example, like accountability. It's not enough to be verifiable, but if something goes wrong, it's better if you can tell who is guilty, so that you have, then the people has less incentives to misbehave. And so there are also many more properties like availability, accessibility. I'm not going to talk about these ones because they are not security properties, but of course they are very important in practice for real people to vote. So if I summarize, I should not be able to prove how I voted, yet I should be able to check that my vote has been counted. So these two opposite properties. So let's see how it can be realized. And I give as an example a protocol that we are developing in our team. It's not solving the whole problem, but some of them. It's a variant of Helios that has been designed by Ben Adida, and so it's developed in our lab. And the main developer is Stéphane Glondu. It has been used, for example, last year in more than 100 elections with about 20,000 ballots. So mostly election in academia. And you're welcome to use our system. The platform is open, free, and you can also run your own server if you want. And so what it achieves is confidentiality of the votes and verifiability of the voting process. And it is verifiable in the sense that the ballot box is public at any time. It's actually a web page. And all the operation can be checked by anyone or by any third-party code. So for this, I need to explain two building blocks from a high level, and two building blocks that are actually widely used in Belenius, but also widely used in e-voting. So the first one is shared decryption. So we need an encryption, public key encryption. So you encrypt with one public key, but no one has the decryption key. The decryption key is shared in several secret keys so that no one can decrypt, but all together, if we are all together, then we can decrypt. So a bit like this lock. You can open the lock only if you have the blue, the yellow, and the black keys. And actually, what exists is even threshold decryption, where you'll have each trustee compute her secret key, then n trustee can jointly compute one public key, and you need t out of n keys to decrypt. And so t is the threshold, so you can have 3 out of 5, 2 out of 3, 7 out of 10. I mean, that's up to the election authority to decide which threshold and how many authority you want. And the good thing about threshold authority is that the decryption key is never present on a single computer. It's really fully distributed among the authorities. So even during key generation or decryption, it's a complete distributed process. So we know how to do it cryptographically. It's a well-understood technique. Although in companies, usually they still generate the decryption key on one computer and then split it, which is not the right way to go. But they say they forget about the key. Okay, so the second building blocks is zero-knowledge proof. So this is the ability to prove that I know something or that I know that something is true without telling you anything more than proving you that I know a data or that a statement is true. So you know the statement is true, but you know nothing else. So for example, for the key, instances that are interesting for us is that if you have the encryption of M with some public key K, then I can prove you that M is zero, either A, that M, my message that is encrypted, is either A or B, without giving you any insight on whether it is rather A or B. Okay, so I can prove you this. I can also prove you that I correctly decrypted a ciphertext. So given a ciphertext C and the message M, I can prove you that M is indeed the decryption of C. Okay, in zero knowledge, so you get to know just that the statement is true and nothing else. So these are two main building blocks for the protocol. So now let's see how it works. So as I said, the ballot box is public, so it's a web page that anyone can see. So let's say that David wants to vote, and he can already see that Alice has voted, Bob and Chris as well. So they have voted something. You can only see the encrypted ballots. And the ballots are encrypted with some public key of the election, PKE. And as I said, the public key of the election is such that no one has a secret key. The secret key is shared among authorities. So when David arrives, so here he will vote only 0 or 1, 0 if he agrees, 1 if he doesn't agree, and of course we can do more complex elections. So if David wants to vote, he will select his choice, VD, encrypted on his computer with the public key of the election. So this is the ballot VD encrypted with the public key of the election. So he can see this ballot on his computer, then send it to the ballot box, and David can check that his ballot appears in front of his name, for example. So he knows that his ballot is on the ballot box. And then when the election is tallied, the encryption that is used is homomorphic. So this is El-Gamal encryption. It's homomorphic in the sense that if you multiply all the encrypted votes, then you get the encryption of the sum of the vote. Okay, and this is due to the fact that G to the A times G to the B is G to the A plus B. So you can just multiply the ballot and you get the encryption of the sum. So what's the point? Because the sum is still encrypted. The point is that you don't need to decrypt the ballots one by one, in which case you would learn how everyone voted. There is only one single ballot that you need to decrypt, which is the sum of the votes, so the result of the election. So you just need to decrypt the result of the election. And so this is what each authority is doing. So provided that you trust at least one of the authority will only decrypt that one. So only the result of the election will be decrypted. And of course, together with the proof that it has been correctly decrypted. So you can trust that the result corresponds to the ballot box. Okay. So actually, I have oversimplified my protocol. So if it was as simple, then David could cheat. Because David is supposed to vote 0 if he disagrees, 1 if he agrees. But what if David is malhonest, dishonest, and actually votes 100? Since the ballot is not open individually, only the results is opened, no one will able to tell, except if David has to cheat in a smart way so that he doesn't stuff the ballots too much. It has to be smaller than the number of voters, but let's say there is a large number of voters. So David could add as many votes as he could, which is not right. So actually, not only David must encrypt his vote, but he should also prove that his vote is either 0 or 1, so that his vote is valid, is a correct possible answer in the election. And this is done again using a zero-knowledge proof. Okay. So this is still slightly oversimplified. Actually, what I've shown to you is the Helios protocol and not the Billenius one. So in Helios, you have the names of the voters that appears, which at least in France would not be compliant with the law because the list of voters is public, but who actually voted is a private information. You may access it, for example, in paper ballot election, you may access it going to the city hall only if you are part of the election, but it's not something that is public on the web. Okay. So, but it's easy not to put the names; they are not necessary for the protocol. But then, if you don't put the names, it's even easier for the ballot box to add ballots. Okay. Provided that the number of voters is smaller than the number of ballots is smaller than the number of voters, which is typically the case, the turnout is often low, then it's easy for the ballot box to just add additional ballots and say, okay, these additional voters did vote. And it will be very difficult to catch. So in Helios, it is partly catched by the fact that, okay, I see that, oh, Piotr, you voted here, but you told me you didn't vote in this election, so then we can start complaining. But if there is not even names in front of them, then it's very, very difficult to catch. So in Billenius, we have some kind of double authentication. Not only voters need to authenticate to the ballot box with standard means, like it's done with login and password, but there's also cryptographic authentication. Voters receive beforehand sign-in keys, and the ballot box only knows the corresponding verification keys. And when David votes, he needs to additionally sign his ballots so that anyone can check that the ballots come from a legitimate voter, so voters that got the sign-in key. Okay, so this is Billenius, and then how to be confident. You see that I show you several variants, they all seem right, and little by little I show that there are attacks, so there might still be attacks there. So the standard practice is to use formal analysis, trying to have a proof that the protocol is correct. So why doing formal analysis? Well, because now in the field, it's really best practice, and it's done now for TLS, 5G, so I don't think I need to convince you here that doing a formal proof is useful. And interestingly, for e-voting, for example, in Switzerland, it's even a legal requirement. So it's even written black on white in the law that they need to provide symbolic and cryptographic proofs of e-voting protocols as soon as they want a certain level of security. And so as soon as they want, for example, that 100% of the population use the e-voting system, then they do need to have a symbolic and a cryptographic proof, which is nice. So, okay, let's prove verifiability and privacy then. And so then, okay, sure, but then how to define vote privacy? So, as the Switzerland said, there are two main models, the formal or symbolic ones and the computational ones. So and we need to do both, right? At least for the Switzerland, and even we'll have more confidence if we do both. So in the formal approach, which I will also call the symbolic models, messages are abstracted away with terms. You only keep the structure of the messages with some symbolic approach. So the adversary is idealized. He can only manipulate terms or decrypt. So this is the Dolev-Yao model where the adversary can decrypt if he has a key, and that's it. So the good thing is that proof can be often automated. There are now many tools in our field, but we may miss some attacks that are closer to the cryptography. So that's why there is also the computational approach, where messages are just bit strings. The encryption are just the actual encryption algorithms. The zero-knowledge proof are the actual zero-knowledge proof algorithm, and so on. The adversary is any polynomial time probabilistic algorithm. So the guarantees are stronger, and the proof has to be done by hand. Typically, also some tools are developed now. And in this computational approach, there are even two sub-approaches. One is game-based. You define your security through games. If the adversary wins, he attacks the system. If he loses, then your system is secure. And another one is simulation-based, where you have some very ideal functionality that is clearly secure, and your system should be as good as this ideal system. So I'm going to switch between these three models in my talk. So let's start with the symbolic model. So how to model vote privacy in symbolic models, which means how to state formally that no one knows whether I voted 0 or 1. So the first idea is that, we know how to do secrecy in protocols, right? We know we have Proverif, we have Tamarin, we have many more models, and we can say secrecy of the key, secrecy of the nonce, so why not say secrecy of my vote? That's the purpose of the tool. Well, the problem is that secrecy of my vote, so secrecy of the value 0 or secrecy of the value 1, is not meaningful, because of course the attacker knows 0 and knows 1, that's just public values. So that's the right question. A key is something random, so it doesn't know in advance the key, while the attacker knows in advance all the possible votes. So he knows 0, he knows 1. Okay. So then the idea would be to use indistinguishability equivalence properties. So the attacker should not be able to distinguish whether Alice is voting 0 or Bob is voting 0. So this doesn't work either, because if you remember the Helios protocol where who votes is publicly displayed, then the attacker can tell whether Alice is voting something or Bob is voting something, just because he can see that Alice is voting or Bob is voting. So it doesn't work. So let's switch it, right? We can say the attacker should not see whether Alice is voting 0 or Alice is voting 1. Okay, it's just the converse statement. So we're getting there, but it still doesn't work, because there is a situation in electronic voting where it's always the case that the attacker knows whether... there is always a situation where the attacker knows for who you voted, always. This is the case of unanimity. Okay? If we all voted for the same value, then we know that, you voted for A, I voted for A, because A got all the votes. So this is how then I know how you voted. So if Alice alone is voting and vote either 0 or 1, the adversary can see the difference just because the results change. And this is actually a real difficulty in electronic voting, is that the result does leak some information about how people voted. That's the purpose, actually. But it should not leak more than the result. That's the idea. So in symbolic models, the current modeling of privacy that has really a good consensus, and that has been proposed by Steve Kramer just here, and is giving the other invited talks, but another subject this afternoon, is that, okay, the attacker should not see the difference on whether between two scenarios, one where Alice votes 0 and Bob votes 1, and the scenario where votes are swapped, so Alice votes 1 and Bob votes 0. So the result stays the same, and whether Alice votes 0, Bob 1, or the contrary, should be indistinguishable to the attacker. The attacker should not see the difference. And this is really the mainstream definition in symbolic models. So what about now computational models? So it's really on the other side of the spectrum that we have this ideal functionality. So this is quite convenient because we just say, okay, voters just vote on a completely secret and private channel. So voter ID 1 votes V1, voter ID 2 votes V2. It's completely ideal. The attacker sees nothing. And the ideal functionality just displays the results, so the sum of the votes. This is my ideal system, and then my system is secure if it is as secure as this ideal functionality that leaks nothing but the result. So this is nice because it's secure by definition, but it's very abstract, so it's difficult to prove, and it's often the case that it's not even realized. So if you have a system, it leaks a bit more information, and so it's not as secure as the ideal functionality, so you cannot conclude. So then we have a game-based definition sitting in the middle, where we let the adversary play a game, and this defines the security. So we could just take Steve's definition. So we could say, okay, the adversary will be in one of the two scenarios, Alice votes 0, Bob votes 1, or the other one where votes are swapped. And the game is that the adversary has to guess in which scenario he is. If he guesses rightly, he wins, otherwise he loses. The issue is that in computational settings, we try to be at the level of the B string, so to capture all kinds of leaks. And this does not capture all attacks, because, for example, it could be that the attacker is not able to win this game, so he's not able to tell when votes are swapped, but he's able to tell when Alice is voting 1 and Bob is voting 1, so they are both voting the same, from another scenario where Alice is voting 0 and Bob is voting 2, so this yields the same result. But maybe the attacker is able to see the difference, so there is some information leaked, but not as strong as he can tell the difference when votes are swapped. So it's slightly too weak definition. And also it doesn't work for complex systems where you have weighted votes, where when you vote depending on, for example, depending on the number of functions I have, then I have more votes. Then this really doesn't, the definition doesn't work for this kind of system. So the game-based definition, many game-based definitions exist, have been proposed in the literature for 20 years. There are neat, simple definitions like one given by Benalo, but they do not handle complex counting functions, a bit like this one. So they do not handle complex functions where you rank candidates and you declare the winner doing, some tally system. And we will even discover that many definitions that have been proposed are actually incompatible with verifiability. So if you are private in that sense, then you cannot be verifiable, which is annoying. Or they were flawed, like they could declare schemes that were secure. So we tried to propose a new one that didn't have the flaw of the other ones. So how does it work? So it's a game, again, where the attacker has to distinguish between two scenarios. One is the real scenario, the real vote. So the voters are voting some value of the votes chosen by the adversary. And the other scenario, the voters are voting for something completely fake. So the adversary has to check whether it's in the real world, where the adversary will actually behave with these votes A, B, A, C, and another world where it's completely different. So this is BB0, this is BB1, and on the real world, the actual board is tallied, so the adversary is going to see the actual result. While on the fake world, the adversary sees votes, but the result will still be given on the left world. So the adversary, and yet the adversary should not see the difference. So he sees ballots that do not contain the actual votes, they contain other votes. He sees the real results, and he should not be able to tell whether he did see the actual ballots or just fake ballots, which captures the intuition that the ballots do not leak anything because the adversary cannot distinguish between the two scenarios. And we need additional properties like the tally should correspond, because this is just about the ballot box. Then we need a property that the result does correspond to that the content of the ballot. Okay. So this is I mean, there are many definitions that actually looks like that one. The game-based definitions are always variant of this, and it's quite hard to be convinced that, okay, this is a plausible definition. I could show you other examples that are also plausible definitions, but many are flawed. So we need some more confidence. So we needed to compare it with the simulation-based privacy definition, the ideal one. And actually, we were able to prove that our game-based definition, plus some additional properties, implies the ideal-based definition. So at least it's not too weak, because it implies ideal-based definition. And also, it can be used as a tool. I was saying that the simulation-based definition is hard to prove. So now it's easier because we can just split it in several game-based properties that are typically easier to prove. And it is compatible with verifiability. You can satisfy this property and being verifiable. So it works for arbitrary counting function, so even not just counting the votes, but also ranked votes. And it can take care of all the auxiliary data you have in the tally, like the zero-knowledge proofs. So I say it's compatible with verifiability. This is not, so the relation between privacy and verifiability are not obvious, because if you think it like a high level, so privacy says you should give no information about how people voted besides the results. And verifiability says you should give enough information to check that each vote is counted. And actually, about 10 years ago, there was a result by David Poincheval and many others showing that privacy and verifiability are actually incompatible. So more precisely, verifiability is incompatible with unconditional privacy. So if you have a system that is verifiable, then it cannot be private against an adversary that has unbounded computational power. So luckily, we are sitting right in the border while we just want privacy against an adversary that has that is polynomially bounded. But if it was not polynomially bounded, like for example, this also says that verifiability is incompatible with everlasting privacy. If you have an adversary that is not bounded, then you lose privacy. And so the fact that these two properties are opposed are also in the public are not just. It's not just a theoretical result. It's often the case that in regulation there are distinction. There is like a prioritization between these two properties. For example, in France or Switzerland, they say, okay, you should first have your system private, and then try to have some form of verifiability, either very little like in France or more and more like in Switzerland, but it's first privacy and then try to add verifiability as soon as it does not compromise privacy. And actually, we showed recently that privacy entails verifiability. So it's not like they are incompatible or opposed. Actually, you cannot hope for privacy if there isn't at least a bit of verifiability, so at least individual verifiability. So if the votes of the honest voter are not counted, then you can't have privacy. So why is it the case? So first, what do I call verifiability? It's really that the result contains at least honest votes. So maybe there are more votes. This is not individual verifiability. But at least the honest votes are in the result. So for example, if Alice votes 0, Bob's vote 1, Charlie votes 1, and if the displayed result is 0, 0, 1, then this is a breach against individual verifiability because I don't have my 3 honest votes. Okay, so at least the honest votes should be counted. So we showed that privacy implies individual verifiability in the computational model using our bprif definition, but it is not really a matter of definition, because we can also show it in symbolic models with Steve's definition. It's still true that if you have privacy in the sense that the attacker doesn't notice when votes are swapped, you do have individual verifiability. So I'm going to give some intuition, because the intuition is actually simple. So the idea is that, well, assume the attacker can break verifiability in a strong sense, so meaning that he can always turn Alice's votes into 1. Okay, so he can make sure it's a strong attack. There is no verifiability because he can always make Alice's votes for 1, and she will not check or she cannot check. Okay, so it's not verifiable in that sense. then you immediately lose privacy. Why? Because the attacker is trying to distinguish between the scenario where Alice is voting 0, Bob is voting 1, and the other scenario where Alice is voting 1 and Bob is voting 0. So now the attacker is going to turn Alice's vote into 1 in both sides. I mean, doesn't know in which side he is. So he's just forcing Alice's vote to be 1. And then you can look at the result. If it's 1-1, then he was on the left. If it is 1-0, then he was on the right. Because the result is going to be 1, the Alice vote, plus Bob's vote, so we can just learn Bob's vote. So we attack privacy. And this idea can be generalized to the general case of individual verifiability. So we can show that as soon as the attacker breaks individual verifiability, it does break privacy. Okay. So this is interesting because it means that if you want to have privacy, then you need some level of verifiability. And in particular, it's often thought that you also have the case where you have no verifiability at all. Okay, so it's you just send your votes to a server. The server with authorities decrypts the result, and that's it. You have no verifiability, and so yeah, okay, but then my vote is at least private if I trust the authorities. That's not the case because maybe the voting server is changing all the votes but yours, and learns how you voted. You would say, oh, these two strong attacks. Well, yeah, but he has the ability to do that. So this is puzzling because you have many protocols that have been proved verifiable without even that has been proved private without being verifiable. So for example, Helios is verifiable, but we can prove it private without modeling the verification steps. So we prove privacy not even caring about verifiability. So the reason is that what we prove is that privacy implies individual verifiability with the same trust assumption. Okay, so if you don't trust the ballot box, then you have privacy. This implies individual verifiability with the same trust assumption on the ballot box, on the authorities, on the network. It's the same trust assumption. And what is typically studied is privacy against an honest ballot box, but verifiability with a dishonest ballot box. Because that's how we can prove privacy of Helios without caring about verifiability. Because Helios, if you trust the ballot box, then of course you have verifiability because the ballot box is going to receive all ballots, and so all the honest votes are counted. If you don't, and Helios is designed even against malicious ballot box. But if you model it, if you assume it assume it honest, then it's even simpler. But this is not completely satisfactory either, because this means that you're using Helios or Belenios or your favorite voting system, and you have privacy, but only if you trust the voting system, the voting server. And this is not, I mean, the voting systems are not designed that way. Intuitively, you should not have to trust the voting server, yet you should have privacy. That's why you're using encryption, that's why the encryption is shared among several authorities. This is because you should not have to trust the ballot box. Yet, usually what is proved is privacy assuming an honest ballot box. So that's an issue. This means that all existing game-based definition implicitly assume the ballot box to be honest, which weakens the privacy guarantees you have, and it also means that we may miss attacks, and that's the case. So there is a privacy attacks against Helios that has been discovered by Peter Rönne a few years ago, while Helios was thought to be already well understood and secure, but actually there is a privacy attack. So we need a privacy definition, so we need a privacy definition that cope with a malicious ballot box. And even in symbolic models, so the one where ballots are swapped, this does not assume an honest ballot box. But typically, when you look at the actual model that exists in Proveri for Tamarin and so on, they also implicitly assume an honest ballot box. Like the way they implicitly assume that all ballots directly goes to the ballot box, and the adversary cannot prevent an honest ballot box from reaching the ballot. that the adversary cannot prevent a ballot, an honest ballot, from reaching the ballot box. So we do need a definition for when there is a malicious ballot box. And why is it hard? I mean, why no one did it before? There are good reasons for that. The first reason is that, okay, obviously, if the board is malhonest, then the adversary can remove all the ballots but one. And then, of course, if you are the only one on the election, then your privacy is lost. But is that true? Well, it depends, because voters may check, right? That's the purpose of verifiability. So in some cases, it's not possible the adversary remove all ballots but one. And there might be other mechanism that protects from deletion. Not necessarily voters have to check, but maybe there are decentralized servers. So you're sure, for example, in the Switzerland, there is some some codes that are return codes. And as soon as you have a return code, you know your ballot is registered. There might be some blockchain or any fancy stuff. Another issue is that if the board is malicious, then the attacker may change the ballot order. Okay, maybe Alice voted first and Bob voted second, and maybe on the board he put Bob first and Alice second. Well, yeah, okay, but we don't care, right? I mean, the result doesn't change. Well, it depends. I mean, maybe the tally function is so subtle, and depending on how early you were in the election, then your votes count more. It's not a very standard election tally system, but this could exist. And again, it depends. I mean, if you have a blockchain, for example, then it cannot be reordered. Another issue is that the attacker may change the vote of some honest ballot, so replacing, if we don't have verifiability, you may replace Alice's vote with something else. Then again, it depends. I mean, maybe it's not possible because there is verifiability, so this would be an attack. And in some scheme, like in Helios, since ballots are not authenticated, then the adversary may change some votes if they do not check. But so is this an attack? In Helios, we know it's possible, so it's not an attack. And in other cases, we know it's not possible, so this would be an attack. Of course, the more the adversary can change, manipulate the votes, like removing votes, reordering votes, changing votes, the less privacy we have, because it can get more information on the result. And we need to decide whether these manipulations are attacks against privacy or just things we know are possible against our scheme. So it depends. So we have proposed a "it depends" definition, which is parameterized by the action that are tolerated from the adversary. So depending on your scheme or just on your setting, who is compromised, you will say, okay, I know the adversary can remove some ballots because I know some people will not check, but just this is not an attack, I know that. Or in other cases, you'll say, no, I won't tolerate any change, so that it can fit several schemes with various levels of privacy. And for a given scheme, it can fit several scenarios, depending on whether we assume every voter vote, every voter check, who is honest, and so on. And this also eases the comparison between schemes, because they might not have the same level of privacy. We'll not declare half of them insecure and half of them secure. We'll say, okay, they have some level of privacy, not exactly the same. So this is an adaptation of our BPRIV definition, where now the adversary controls the ballot box. So the voters vote. The adversary gets to see the ballots, either with the actual votes or with fake votes. And this is the adversary that produces the board. Okay, it can produce an arbitrary vote, BB0. People do checks if they have to do, and then the result is tallied on the board. This is what happens on the left board. On the right board, it's a bit embarrassing because the adversary is also producing an arbitrary board, and we need to decide what to tally. And it cannot be the left board because we don't know the left board, because the left board is when we are in the left world where the adversary gets to see the left ballots. Here we are in the right world, and the adversary we just have the boards given by the adversary. So we know what would be the ideal results containing all the honest votes that come from the left board, but we don't know which one the adversary kept or how they modify it. So what we do is that we tally this ideal board, but learning from the board produced by the adversary, which votes should be deleted, casted, or changed. And the adversary, again, should not see the difference. So then we can adapt our ideal functionality similarly where the adversary, so the ideal functionality is we just return the result. The modified ideal functionality is where the adversary can also the adversary can also send some abstract command like delete some message, or add ballots, like cast additional ballots, change some votes. Okay, so this is not a so ideal functionality, it's a semi-ideal functionality. And then the result is just the sum of the votes after the manipulation. So now this means that we can degrade the ideal functionality to something less ideal that maybe reflects better what the adversary can do. And we can show again that our privacy definition implies a simulation-based ideal definition. And this is true for any, so this is true as soon as, however, the adversary modifies the ballots in our BPRIV definition, then this can be reflected on the ideal one. So for example, we can have that mbpriv where the adversary can just delete ballots. This corresponds to the ideal functionality where the adversary can say, okay, I want to remove this and this vote. If I can prove privacy where the adversary can delete ballots and also reorder them, then I have privacy with an ideal functionality where the adversary can delete votes and reorder votes, and so on. And so this is very flexible. We still have now with a malicious board, so it's still true that privacy implies individual verifiability, so now with a malicious board. And we can apply this to several schemes. So for example, Helios with revote is flawed. As I said, this is the attacks of Peter Rohn, so this is completely flawed. But if there is no revote, so voters never vote again, then if every voter check, we can show that this realizes the ideal functionality, but in an ideal scenario where every voter votes and check. Otherwise, Helios has some privacy, but only for an ideal functionality that tolerate deletion, reorder, and change manipulation. And then you have other schemes like Bilinios and Civitas, where we achieve, so we never achieve the very ideal functionality, because the attacker can always at least delete ballots from voters who do not check, so unless all voters checks. And otherwise, we do have at least privacy so ideal privacy where the adversary can delete ballots. This is the highest level of privacy achieved by this scheme. And so the nice thing about our definition is that we can have this kind of comparison. So we do not just say that Helios is insecure, because it's not true. Helios has some security, and we can pinpoint which one. And then we can compare schemes. And this is only for ideal functionality, but of course, maybe you'll come up with another scheme that will achieve a slightly different ideal functionality. And so you'll have an order between the functionality, and you'll be able to compare the level of privacy. So to summarize, defining security is complex. A bit more precisely, so if the adversary controls the network, this is the basic assumption, and if we have dishonest voters, and we have a definition of privacy in the game-based setting, it entails simulation-based privacy, and it even entails individual verifiability. We can do the same thing with dishonest board. And then here we still have a lot of implicit assumptions, like the tally is honest, and the protocol is quite simple, just people vote and there is only, you vote, your ballot is there, and there is no there is not a lot of interaction between voters and the ballot box. So for all these cases, well, we don't know, we don't even have definition, so there is still a lot of work to do here, so just to define privacy. And I didn't even speak about receipt freeness and coercion resistance, and not even of new emerging properties like accountability, dispute resolution that are just about to be understood, like at least at an informal level. So we do not have at all definition. So there is a lot of work to do still on the definition side. Thank you.
We can take some questions, and I suggest we use the microphone because we're recording everything, and otherwise we won't be able to hear the questions. So if you want to ask some questions, come to the microphone.
Hello. I've got a stack of questions about 3 pages long, but I'll pick the good
We
ones.
have the whole break.
So around slide 25, you talked about a definition in the symbolic model to do with swapping two agents' votes. And then you talked about why that wasn't fully appropriate in the simulation model, and you said, okay, we propose this alternative definition. Have you ever considered trying to translate this back into a symbolic model and saying, well, if we take our simulation and look at it in the symbolic model, it looks like this?
Yes, so actually, so not me, but the PhD students of our groups, they have exactly this idea. So they are currently trying to modeling back this game-based definition in the symbolic models, and maybe it even simplifies the model because maybe you don't even need 2 voters but only 1. So I do not have a definitive answers like yes it works, but yeah, our PhD students are really on it. So maybe in a few years, a few months or years.
Okay, can I go for another one? Okay. So you talked about this idea that to some extent privacy entails verifiability. And from what I understand of your very informal proof, it's that it's to do with this tally function, and you can count how many votes are done each way. Does the scenario change at all if, for example, instead of doing a tally, you use some kind of like a shared computation thing where you just compute the greater of the two rather than actually counting in full?
So this is yeah, you're right. You're pointing to. So let me say more precisely what we show. So what we show is that privacy entails that the final ballot box that is about to be tallied contains the honest vote. And this is true for any counting function that has partial tally. And partial tally means that if you split your board in 2 subboards and you tally you can tally in blocks. Like I split it 2, I tally the first part, the second part. I have a way to merge the results. So for example, if you declare only the winner, like the one that has the maximum number of votes, this doesn't have subtally, the partial tally property, because if I split in 2, well, you lose too much information. So yeah, it's true. It's precisely what we say is that you're sure for tally functions that have the partial tally property, you're sure that the honest votes reach the final ballot box, the one that is about to be tallied. And then we assume the tally to be honest, so by indeed distributed means, but we do not analyze that. So.
Okay, I think thank you. I'll chase you down at some point later as well. Thanks so much.
You mentioned everlasting privacy, and I wonder what would be an idea to actually get everlasting privacy.
So there are some schemes that are everlasting private, or are claimed to be, are reasonably everlasting private, say. For example, by Olivier Pereira, where what you publish on the bulletin board is not the encrypted ballot. So if I've seen that this is your encrypted ballot, then later on I'll be able to decrypt, and then I will know your vote. What they publish is a Pedersen commitment on your vote, which means that right now there is only a way to decommit, but later on you can decommit it to any vote, so there won't be enough information to know for who you voted. So there are some directions.
So I got one last question before we take the break. So you mentioned at the beginning you don't want to cover availability as a property, but I guess topically I feel like election interference is a thing nowadays, and taking down an election could be quite a problematic issue. So have you thought about methods to address availability, some sort of distributed voting or some other techniques? Is that in scope for you at some point?
Like pure network availability are not in the scope for what I'm doing, say, because it's clearly important, but it's kind of orthogonal to what the voting protocol are achieving. On the other hand, what we are always saying is, our protocol is verifiable, so everything is going right. This is another availability issue somehow, because then if someone can complain, because the idea is that it's not that everything will, because we have verifiability, everything will go right. The thing is that if something will go wrong, we'll notice. So if something goes wrong, we just stop the election and we restart. which might not be satisfactory. So this is even and this is clearly now this part of unavailability. Like if a single voters could produce election data that are invalid and we just restart the election, this would be clearly too weak protocols. So for this kind of unavailability property, this is within our scope, although we don't have good solution yet.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank the speaker one more time, and we'll start with the next session at 10:45, I think.